Last week, we finished up one big chunk of materials involving categorical propositions and the categorical syllogisms and so on. Categorical syllogisms were the concern for logicians for, say, 2,000 years. Greek philosophers were also interested in evaluating categorical syllogisms. Chapter 10 is really the beginning of what we may call modern logic, which has been developed and shaped for the last 100 years. So this chapter 10, is really the beginning of contemporary modern logic. Okay? And we will spend a few chapters for what's called propositional logic. And in this chapter, the author introduces to us some familiar patterns of valid arguments. Exactly speaking, there are four familiar types of valid arguments, good arguments. These patterns are recurrent, very familiar to us, and that's why I think the author introduces these four types of valid arguments in this chapter. Okay, so this is more like a warming up for the propositional logic system that we are going to learn for the next couple of weeks. Okay, so what is the first type of valid arguments? It's called the disjunctive syllogism, a valid argument involving disjunction, that is OR. Okay? Says, basically the disjunctive syllogism has this form. It says, the first premise is P or Q. And the second premise says not P. Then it follows that Q is true. Okay? It sounds obvious, and it should sound obvious to you. Okay? So either P is the case or Q is the case. And given that we know that P is not the case, then of course Q has to be the case. Okay? So it's a valid argument. Conclusion follows necessarily from these two premises. You can easily find examples in ordinary arguments. Okay. Let's say bus number 9 or subway transmission, subway goes to the zoo. Not P means number 9 bus is out of service today, then you have to take subway to the zoo. Okay? So this is a very familiar type of a valid argument, and logicians calls it disjunctive syllogism. The remaining three types of valid arguments, all of them involve hypothetical proposition. So we need to know what a hypothetical proposition is. Basically, a hypothetical proposition is a conditional statement. In English, typically it's expressed by saying if P, then Q. Okay. In the next chapter, chapter 12, we will see that logicians use what's called horseshoe to symbolize that. Okay, so logicians use this sign, horseshoe, to symbolize a hypothetical proposition. Okay. So this means if P, then Q. Okay. The left-hand side of horseshoe is called a sufficient condition, and the right-hand side is called a necessary condition. Okay? Or other terminologies that the P, the left-hand side is also called the antecedent. The right-hand side is called consequent of the conditional. Okay? So you can say that the left-hand side of a conditional, that is the antecedent, specifies the sufficient condition, while the right-hand side, that is the consequent of the conditional, specifies the necessary condition. Okay? Hypothetical propositions are also expressed in ordinary English in many different ways. Other than if-then statement, we also have other expressions that express hypothetical proposition. Okay? For example, in English, we use only if. P only if Q is equivalent to if P then Q. So you can see that what comes after only if is the necessary condition. Okay? We also use the expression unless. Okay? Unless is the same thing as if not. Okay? So how do you translate P unless Q into a logical symbol? Well, you first translate this P unless Q into P if not Q, and then you translate this into a logical symbol. For example, this is what? This is saying the same thing as if not Q, then P. So you can symbolize this by saying not Q, then P. Okay? We will come back to this in chapter 12. We also use the expressions no P, no Q. And this is equivalent to saying if Q, then P. Okay? When you say no P, no Q, P specifies a necessary condition. So for example, when you enter a restaurant, on the door, it may say no shoes, no entrance. Now this means that wearing shoes is a necessary condition for you to enter the restaurant. Okay? It would be a mistake to read this as saying wearing shoes is sufficient condition for entering a restaurant. That's a mistake. Okay? When someone says no shoes, no entrance, what that means is wearing shoes is just a necessary condition. You have to wear it. Okay? You have to wear shoes to enter. Okay? But just wearing shoes in itself may not be sufficient, okay, for entrance. Similarly, for let's say no pain, no gain, okay. Or similarly, let's say no efforts. No efforts, no success. Okay? All of these specifies a necessary condition. So if a student complains to me after getting a bad grade and says, well, you said no efforts, no success, and I have made a great effort, so I have to get a good grade, then that's a bad argument. Okay, making efforts is a necessary condition for being successful, but unfortunately, it's not sufficient. Okay. All right. So there are a variety of expressions in English that express hypothetical propositions, and you have to know how to translate them, how to figure out which is necessary and which is sufficient. Okay? The next form of valid arguments, next type, these two types, both of them involve hypothetical proposition. Okay? Here, okay, there is hypothetical proposition. Here again, okay. So hypothetical proposition, if P then Q, and we also know that P is true, then it follows that Q is true. Okay. Again, it's very obvious, obviously valid. Okay. If P then Q, P is true, then of course Q is true. Okay. A very familiar type of valid argument. It's so familiar that logicians have given a name for this type. It's called MP, abbreviating modus ponens. Okay. We will come back to this later, but yeah, that's one familiar type of valid argument involving hypothetical proposition. The other type is if P then Q, and we know that Q is not the case, then we can conclude that P is not the case. Okay? It goes the opposite way. Okay? It's called MT, modus tollens. And again, this is a valid argument. There are hypothetical arguments that look like this, but not valid arguments. And these are examples. Okay? Let's say, suppose if P then Q, and you know that Q is the case, can you conclude that P is the case? Well, not necessarily. Okay? This is invalid argument. In other words, the conclusion doesn't follow from these two premises. Okay? This is a fallacy called affirming the consequent. Okay? This is bad argument. If P then Q and P is not the case, can you conclude that Q is not the case? No. And that's invalid. This is also invalid argument. It's called denying the antecedent. Okay? Both of these are invalid arguments. And they look more like MP or MT. So people confuse them, okay, with the valid ones. But we shouldn't. Okay? These two are invalid arguments. The last type of hypothetical syllogism is if P then Q and Q then R, then it follows that if P then R. Okay? It goes like this. If P then Q, Q then R. Okay? So the conclusion, if P then R, follows. So this is the last type of valid arguments that is introduced in chapter 10. And we will talk more about propositional logic in the next week. Okay, so.